Thank y'all for sticking around. I look forward to being able to fellowship here in just a moment. I won't take our time. I'll make sure we're back there in plenty of time to eat, and looking forward to that, celebrating Rhett's graduation, and being a part of that. We're coming to the close of our church history lessons. We've gone through quite a bit, again, following through from the original church to the falling away. And what we'd like to try to do today is look at some of the pioneer preachers. So we talked about Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, and those men are important. They really kind of started a lot of these movements in such a way, but there are also other men that had a part in this, and some of these men, you may think, well, what's the benefit of reading about these men? Some of them we're going to, when we talk about next week's class. So what we've been going through in some of the history, eventually, not this coming Sunday, or not next Sunday, but the next, I hope that you're here for that. We're going to try to do the idea of how the church was coming about into Crockett County, how it came down into West Tennessee. So when we get into some of that, we have to talk about some certain things next week about what we call the Christian church. It's what you're coming out of this movement is the Christian church. So when you begin to look in the early 1800s, you find Christian churches popping up around the area. And then we find churches of Christ, and what that was is the Christian church began to accept musical instruments, and the Church of Christ broke away from that. So we'll talk about that a little bit next week. We'll talk about the missionary society and all that, and kind of going on with Campbell and some of that work that he was trying to do. So we'll talk about that next week. So some of these men we kind of have to talk about to springboard us into next week, and then that helps us to springboard us into the following Sunday when we talk about the Churches of Christ coming into Crockett County. I have been enjoying that thoroughly, being able to talk to many of you. Mr. Harold and I were able to get out the other day, ride around. He was showing me some of the places and things like that as well. Enjoyed that time with him, and it's very beneficial to, I think, both of us maybe, and even Miss Becky probably, getting him out of the house like that. But enjoyed that, and I look forward to being able to present that to you. Now, let's look at some of these pioneer preachers. This first fella, if you do any studying of church history, any church of the movement of the church in the United States, you're going to see this fella. His name is Walter Scott. Walter Scott. So this individual, what we're going to find from these men, and I'm going to try to make sure, I think I've got too much material, so I may skip ahead a little bit through some of this just to get to, there's a few key characters that I want to make sure we touch on, again, springboarding us into some of the other studies. So we find Walter Scott. He's from Scotland. He's going to begin, notice the timing of this, 1796. So he's one of the more prominent members of this. So when you start hearing about Campbell and Stone, though they're probably the most prevalent, you begin to hear, again, this name Walter Scott. So this individual. He wanted to be a Christian, or wanted to be a preacher. His parents wanted him to be a preacher, and he took the necessary academic preparation, and he studied at the University of Edinburgh, and he completed his college courses there. But soon after completing this training, he came to America. Again, what we're finding through the other studies is that these men are finding this religious freedom. There's a lot of freedom to be had over in America, a lot of gain for men that are willing to do this. So we find him coming over to America. Now we're going to see that on his mother's side, he had an uncle that was in a government position in New York City, so that's really going to help him springboard his career. I've got an uncle, he's in New York, this is going to help me. So he comes over to New York City in July of 1818. So again, notice this. A few weeks ago we were talking about this, the movement really taking place. Campbell and them didn't get here till like 1805, 1807. So some of these things beginning to take shape in the early 1800s. So now we have it at 1818 when he arrives in America. So when he comes in, he meets this fellow, Mr. George Forrester, and he was the principal of the best academy in Pittsburgh, and quick to recognize the superior talents and training of Walter Scott. So this man Forrester, he takes an interest in Scott because of his intelligence, and he began to teach him. Again, his pupil, kind of having that relationship with him in that way. And Scott soon found that Mr. Forrester had a particular set of views that were not really following with some of the doctrine, the religious doctrine of the time. So notice here, he says Mr. Forrester's peculiarity consisted in making the Bible his only authority and guide in matters of religion, while his young friend had been brought up to regard Presbyterian standards as true and authoritative exposition and summary of Bible truth. So Scott was a Presbyterian. We find that with many of these men, and we find that he's beginning to read or listen to this man Forrester, and that he says, I'm just going to take the Bible. So again, we find this being about, that you just give me the Bible in the sense of that. So about this time, he discovered a pamphlet that he's going to see that a congregation in New York City was going to put out in regard to baptism, essentially about like what our lesson was today, and the importance of it. Again, the Presbyterian church would preach infant baptism, so they would say, well, I'm reading this, I'm studying the Bible, I'm trying to do this. So he would go up to New York and begin to preach, but he would find that they weren't really on the same page that he was, and he would come back, and he would later write, or he'd go back to Pittsburgh, and he would write for the Christian Baptist. Now, the Christian Baptist was important because this was one of Alexander Campbell's publications that would go out. He first had the Christian Baptist, then he had the Millennial Harbinger. So he finds himself situated around Ohio, and then he makes his way down into Kentucky, where he will eventually die in 1861. So what's the importance of Walter Scott? We find him really being influential in this Ohio, Kentucky area, the same as Stone and Campbell, and the fact that he is helping write for the Christian Baptist. So these views, he's following a lot of the same views as Campbell. Now let's look at this next fellow, W.K. Pendleton. Now really the only, and he's an interesting example of a fella anyway, but what's important about W.K. Pendleton, what we really need to take from him today, is essentially that he is going to be in a university. He's going to be a very bright-minded individual, but as you can see from the PowerPoint, in June 1840, now again, look at this timing, 1840, he's baptized by Alexander Campbell. So he is going to he's going to be in these universities of Virginia. Alexander Campbell is going to eventually set up his college there in Bethany, Virginia. This college is going to teach Bible there, and he's wanting Pendleton to be a part of that. Pendleton kind of wanted to be into the law, get into the law side of it. He wanted to be a congressman and eventually see where that took him. But Campbell's really going to press upon him the fact that he needs to be a preacher. So what he's doing is he's wanting to be this government official, and he's doing all this, as we noted on there, that all of his plans in education pointed towards career in politics, but Campbell could see the potential in Pendleton and wanted him to be a part of Bethany College. So the influence, I guess, of a father-in-law, he's eventually going to marry Alexander Campbell's daughter. So he's going to marry her, he's going to be in that, and Campbell can see in this man a really bright future for the college. Now, not only is he going to be a part of the college, but eventually Campbell's going to be getting a little older. Again, this is 1840. Campbell coming over in 1807, and he wasn't a really young man when he came over then, so he's going to be getting some age on him. So essentially, he's going to want to hand the reins over to Pendleton. So he's going to become the editor of the Millennial Harbinger, now from the Christian Baptist, now to this publication. Now, really what I want to mention with him, and what's going to be important as we go to next week, is that he's going to help plan and develop this American Christian Missionary Society. And that's really going to be a big flaw with Campbell, that we find him wanting to have this central organization that's going to help the church. And I think he came by it honest the way his views were, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week. But he was looking for a way in which the church could reach out and help organize things as a central thing. He saw it as expedient to help teach and preach, to follow the Great Commission. But Pendleton's going to be really influential when it comes to the American Christian Missionary Society. In fact, when they're going to call the meeting to discuss this, it seems coincidental that Campbell is going to get sick. He's not going to be able to attend, and Pendleton will go in his place. Eventually, they're going to pass and they're going to have this. So we're going to see that kind of a falling out as we continue on. So that's really all we need to know about Pendleton as we progress. He was Campbell's son-in-law. He pretty much took the head of the reins over what Campbell was doing, and he's going to be very influential in the American Christian Missionary Society. Now, let's talk about this individual right here. Raccoon John Smith. You probably heard that name. I know I have mentioned it several times. He has a little bit more of the colorful characters that we find throughout the Restoration activity. We find him being born in East Tennessee, October 15th, 1784. Now, the reason they called him Raccoon John Smith is while he was preaching, they asked him where he was from, and he told them over in East Tennessee where the raccoons live. So that's where he got his name. They would poke fun at him. A very simple man. He didn't have much of an education. But Campbell said of this man, he said, John Smith is the only man that I ever knew who would have been spoiled by a college education. The fact that Smith was so simple-minded, and not simple-minded as being as insulting, but he just took the Bible for what it was. He had that type of mindset, and he was very clever with his arguments. We find other men like that, like Marshall Keeble. If you go read about Marshall Keeble, very intelligent man, very knowledgeable of the Bible, and he took the Bible for the Word of God, and we find him being very influential in that way as well, and that's what we find Smith doing the same way. Now, this is what's interesting, and this is what we find, again, these men, what he would do was he was Calvinistic, so he would be trying to, he wanted to become a preacher, but to the Calvinist, you had to get the call. You had to be called to preach. I say this jokingly, like a preacher back home. I got a call to preach, and it was from Brother Glenn Lee one night. It was a Thursday night. He said, the church down the road, I'm busy. Your cousin's busy. You're preaching Sunday. So that was my call to preach. He called me and said, we can't do anything about it. You're the only one left, so you've got to go preach for this congregation. So again, but this what these men were looking at was a call from God. So I don't say that to make light, again, of that stuff. But some people believe that. They get a call, that God speaks to them in some way. So what he's trying to do is he's anxiously waiting for this. He wants to study the Bible. He wants to preach. And he's waiting for this type of calling to come to him. And he had heard of other calls of individuals, a very emotional, very adventurous style of calling. And he said, I'm waiting for that, but it never came. So we went ahead and began to preach, and sometimes they would ridicule him because he was not called. He didn't really get the calling, and he was very distraught about this. He said, I want to do what God wants me to do. I want to preach the gospel. I want to do what God commands me to do. So finally, some individuals said, well, you have been converted. Well, that seems odd to us today to think about that. But what we find is when they begin to preach the Bible that they are converted. But they said that, no, you need the Holy Spirit to work upon you. So he says, what should I do, right? What can I do? I want to be a preacher, but you say I'm converted, but I haven't got the calling. So he says, I have to preach. Notice he says, brethren, what shall I do? I must preach. I cannot preach if I do not study the New Testament. What was happening here was that he couldn't get his calling, so he began to read the Bible. And he began to read it, and as he read it, he's like, oh, this is what I need to be doing, right? This is what I have to be following. And they kind of fussed at him because they said, you're preaching too much Bible. Can you imagine that? Preaching too much Bible. And they said, you need to back off of some of this. And he says, again, I've got to study the New Testament. I've got to preach. How can I do that other than that? Of course, they said, the Lord would reveal that to you. We understand that that's not the case. Now, he was reprimanded for preaching too much Bible. Now, sometime after that, we're going to find that someone asked Smith afterwards what he thought of Mr. Campbell, if he was one of the elect or not. So again, to get the calling, you were one of the elect. He began to read the Christian Baptist. He began reading the Bible, following what Campbell was saying, seeing that he was accurate on these things. And I'll notice what Smith replies is, I know nothing about the man, but he be saint or devil, he has thrown more light on the Galatian letter and on the whole Scriptures than I have received in all the sermons that I've ever heard before. It's amazing when we hear those passages, these things taught, and we think, I need the Bible. Give me the Bible. Just give me the Bible. I'll make my own opinion up after that. So now we find here afterwards that he is going to go on to do a lot of really good works. John Smith does. I think there's actually a book in our library that is his biography, some letters about him, some stuff about him. So he's a good fella, a very colorful character in that, and we're going to find that he actually went and preached to a lot of the Baptist congregations, again being Calvinistic, and he converted entire congregations when he would get up and preach. So amazing the type of a man that he was, and later he would die on February 28th in 1868. So again in Lexington, Kentucky. So we find these men around this Kentucky area, 1868, so doing all this through here. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time, so let's go through here. Brother J.W. McGarvey. You've heard that name more than likely. You've probably read a commentary that had his name stamped in it. You've probably read a book that maybe he had wrote. A very influential man there. Now, he's going to be born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, March 1st, 1829. So he's going to be in this Kentucky area, and that's going to be beneficial because Miss Doris Cox and I were talking about that the other day, that an individual from her family, this Moses Cox, and we're going to talk about him in a couple weeks, coming down into Crockett County, that his father was moved from Glasgow, Kentucky, which is going on very similar to the places where Garvey and Stone are having their territory. Don't know that that means anything, but I'll show you that hypothesis when we get there. So he enters in Bethany College. So Alexander Campbell has set this college up, 1847. He enrolls in. And when he hears this, when he hears the gospel taught, he obeys the gospel, and he's immersed in 1848. So we find him obeying the gospel there, and in 1841 he became the minister of the church at Fayette, Missouri. So this Christian church would be established here, following after that, the Church of Christ, and so it's Fayette, Missouri. Now, he moves back from Fayette, Missouri. He moves to Lexington, Kentucky from Missouri and became the preacher of the Main Street Church in Lexington. Now, I want to make one point about this fellow, too, real quickly, is that when he gave his graduation speech, he gave it all in Greek. So this is the type of man that he was, a very educated scholar. So when you read any of McGarvey's lessons, understand the man you're reading, that he gave his speech that he upon his graduation entirely in Greek. Of course, I had heard that it was in Latin. Regardless, in Latin or Greek, I couldn't do either one. So he's a better man than me in that regard. So this is the type of educated man we're talking about. Now here, real quickly, look at these books. If you don't have these books, I would encourage you to try to grab these, especially the original commentary on Acts. McGarvey does such a wonderful job. In fact, when you look at the lands of the Bible, that book, it is said that McGarvey went over to the Holy Lands, and he said he went over there with a yardstick, tape measure. He was going to prove that the Bible was accurate in these places, and we find that he did, and that's a great book to read. So any of those books that you would be interested, or any of those topics that might interest you, I would encourage you to get McGarvey. He's a great influence to the church, a great man, a great scholar, and very knowledgeable of what he reads. So again, the original commentary on Acts is a great one to grab. If you don't get those, I'll try to put those back up here in a moment. But let's move ahead, and this is the gentleman I really want to talk about because it's going to springboard us into a couple weeks. This man right here, Jefferson Davis Tant. J.D. Tant is what he would be called, typically referred to. He's going to be born in June 28th of 1861 in Cartersville, Georgia. And he is going to be a Methodist circuit rider in 1880, and he's going to travel around the North Texas area. So 1881, he's a Methodist preacher, but he's going to obey the gospel, and he's going to be a preacher for the Church of Christ. Now, this is important because he's going to hear a man named H.D. Carrington, and he's going to become a preacher, and he's going to go out and preach the gospel. Now, why this man is important, let me show you this. Let me just flip ahead to this next slide. So he's living in Hamilton, Texas, and this guy is, he is a Wild West type figure when you read about this man. For 15 years, and then Tant moved to Victoria, Texas, and then to Cohan, Texas. But look at the bottom part there of the slide. He moved to Macon, Tennessee in 1904. So his son, Yater, I assume it's his son, Yater Tant, was born there in 1908. Now, why this is beneficial, with all the research that I'm doing, some of the records, the Miller's Chapel, Church of Christ in Dyer County. So many of you I've talked to that down on Bonnicord. Their records of the Miller's Chapel have J.D. Tant preaching there at their church. And when you go back and look at the history of the Murray City Church of Christ, it being established or meeting officially around 1907, some of the members coming from the Antioch Church and things like that, that J.D. Tant was mentioned as well, preaching for the Murray City Church of Christ. So it's important, I guess to me, or it's interesting to me, that we find these men going about doing the work here in the Restoration movement. So what we have is this man, he was a circuit rider for the Methodist Church, obeying the gospel, preaching around Texas and Tennessee. And we find him even coming down here and even closer to home in Miller's Chapel and in Murray City. Now, that's what I've got. I'm going to put that list of books back up there in case you're interested in any of them. Are there any questions or comments maybe about any of those men or anything like that? All right. That's not all of them. There's a good bit of these men. Brother, I think it's W.B. West. He's a West, nonetheless. He's got a book, The Search for the Ancient Order. Go back. I would encourage you to read some of those, and that'll get you along from the 1800s up to further on. But it's a good read. There's a lot of men in there, a lot of men we didn't get the chance to talk about that were influential as well. But I was hoping maybe some of these, again, next week when we kind of talk about this split of the disciples of Christ and the Church of Christ, that'll help us in that. And then as we begin to look at our study of the church coming in here to West Tennessee. So I'm excited to do that.